Well, greetings everyone from across the time zones. My name is Valentine Moghadam. I'm a professor of sociology and international affairs at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts, USA, and I'm very happy to chair this session, How Sanctions Work. The question of sanctions has animated much discussion, debate, and research, and the IIEA has already had at least one webinar on the topic, which I was similarly pleased to chair. Many of you will know of the paper series Iran Under Sanctions, which is available online, and the forthcoming, or the recent book by Narges Bajogli, Vali Nast, and our two speakers today, Djavad Salehi and Ali Vaez. I also just published a paper on the gender dynamics of US-Iran relations with a focus on sanctions, and it just came out in Third World Quarterly. There also is an international literature on sanctions, including the book by Nicholas Mulder on sanctions in interwar Europe, which I highly recommend for a historical and comparative perspective. I should mention that because of the time change, and especially changing the start hour, for those of us in US Eastern time from 11 to noon, I can only spend an hour with you as I have a meeting shortly after 1 p.m. that I must attend. But Professor Mohammad Farzanegan has kindly agreed to take over when I leave. So let's begin. And in the interest of time, each of our two speakers, and at their own request, by the way, each of our two speakers will present for about 10 minutes or so, followed by Q&A. And we will start with Ali Vaez. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here with Djavad and all of you and have a discussion that is actually always timely related to sanctions, because it's always a feature of US policy towards Iran, and that has been the case for the past 45 years. I thought I would touch on three main subjects. One, why did this book come together? What was behind the pages that you have in front of you? Second, what has been the impact of sanctions on Iran and whether they have been able to achieve their objectives? And finally, what are the main challenges with sanctions from a policy perspective and lessons learned from the case of Iran as one of the most sanctioned countries in the world? And of course, in this group of mostly economists, I think the second part of this conversation with Professor Salehi-Isfahani would be the real fascinating one here. So I had this question during the Trump administration, where, of course, the main focus of US policy once again had become the use of economic coercion in order to achieve a set of objectives that former Secretary of State Pompeo had outlined, that whether there is actually enough focus in US administrations, especially Treasury Department and OFAC, in understanding the impact of sanctions. Because in most of my own conversations with US policymakers, what I would hear were really superficial criteria to assessing the impact of sanctions. For instance, the currency exchange rate, or unemployment, or inflation. And that seemed to be a really superficial way of looking at things. And so I reached out to Djavad, and we coordinated with Vali and Narges, and we brought together a group of multidisciplinary experts to look at different dimensions of this. Of course, the economic dimension is the most important dimension, no doubt about it. This is a tool of economic warfare. But again, even from an economic perspective, there was a need to do a deep dive, which was done by our team. And these reports came out under the umbrella of Iran Under Sanctions at SAIS Johns Hopkins. And then we started going beyond the economic issue and looking at the impact on the society, the impact on Iran's cultural spheres, even the environmental impact of sanctions, gender issues, pharmaceutical and medical industry, and so on. And then once we had all of these reports by outstanding experts, we came to the conclusion that it is important to put it together and draw a big picture, which is the genesis of this book. Now, of course, when we talk about the impact of sanctions, and as you have it in the title of the book, the question is not really whether sanctions have an effect or not. Without any doubt, sanctions have had a devastating impact on the Iranian economy. The real question is whether they are effective in advancing the policy objectives that have given rise to them. Again, it's very clear in the case of Iran. You look across the board. All the if we use a criteria which is the threat perception that U.S. and U.S. allies have of Iran, those are often defined by a few specific issues, like Iran's nuclear program, like Iran's missile program, like Iran's support for non-state actors in the region and beyond, and Iran's human rights situation. Across the board, if you look at the impact of sanctions, all of these issues have been exacerbated over the period that sanctions have been in place. Iran is now much more aggressive in the region, much more assertive in pursuing its nuclear agenda, much more repressive at home. And all of these have happened under sanctions. And so in that sense, sanctions have not succeeded in bringing about the objectives that the U.S. had in mind. Now, there is a myth in Washington that sanctions did work under the Obama administration, and that is the reason that Iran came to the negotiating table and agreed to the JCPOA. I think it is wrong to say that sanctions did not play any role in facilitating the JCPOA, but it's also wrong to only credit the sanctions with the reason that the JCPOA succeeded. I would argue if there wasn't a delicate diplomacy that was facilitated and mediated by Oman in 2011, 2012, and also the decision by the Obama administration to step aside from the maximalist objective of depriving Iran of having any enrichment capabilities on its own soil, there would not have been a deal regardless of the degree of sanctions that were imposed. Because at the end of the day, if you're a weaker country like Iran in comparison with the United States, you cannot validate the big baton that is in the hands of the bigger power, because then it will become a slippery slope of concessions one after another. And so I've always argued that the one thing that the Iranian leadership perceives as more dangerous from suffering from sanctions is surrendering to them, because of the lesson that it would teach to the United States. And in that sense, the Obama administration's decision to make the first concession as the stronger party was what made the JCPOA possible. But this brings me to the last part of what I wanted to say, which is the main shortcoming of sanctions. In the past 20 years, the U.S. has significantly increased their use as a tool of statecraft. In fact, we have had 900% increase in the number of designations in the course of the past 2 decades. But the U.S. has also proven unable to provide effective and sustainable sanctions relief. And I think that really diminishes the utility of this powerful tool as a tool that could be used in delicate diplomacy. Of course, the experience with Iran in 2016, when sanctions were lifted and there was an administration in place that actually wanted the Iranians to be able to reap the benefits of sanctions relief, is quite telling, because the chilling impact of U.S. sanctions did not dissipate with the removal of those sanctions. And this is rooted in a structural problem with sanctions that, in fact, unlike a regular war that is in the power of the president to agree to a ceasefire or to stop or end the hostilities, ending economic warfare cannot only be done by the executive branch. It requires congressional intervention as well. And of course, in a very polarized environment, that is a high bar. In the case of a federal system like the United States, it also at times requires the states to also cooperate. As you remember, during the JCPOA's implementation, almost half of the states in this country did not agree to put aside their divestment acts against Iran. If you're a state like New York, given the importance that New York has in global financial system, that will have significant chilling effect on the impact of sanctions relief. But in addition to the failure to provide effective sanctions relief, the other qualifier here is sustainable sanctions relief. And of course, we had the experience of the Trump administration reneging on the commitments of its predecessor, despite the fact that Iran was complying with its obligations under the JCPOA as verified by the International Atomic Energy Agency. But we also had in much more of recent vintage in the Biden administration, a similar experience that we had a detainee deal last summer, which resulted in also a humanitarian deal through which the Biden administration allowed Iran to use some of its frozen assets that were moved from South Korea to Qatar for humanitarian trade. But once October 7th happened, and as soon as Hamas paraglided into Israel, the Biden administration pulled the plug on that deal and de facto restricted Iran's access to those assets, which under existing U.S. laws could be used for humanitarian trade, which is exempt from U.S. sanctions. And that, I think, had a really negative impact on the psyche of the Iranians, because they came to the conclusion that it's not just a question of a change in administrations and change of power in Washington, but also the general question of reliability of the United States as a negotiating partner. And I think that's a major element of shortcoming in U.S. sanctions policy, that if you look at the way that OFAC is designed, in the way that sanctions are taught through in this town, it really amounts to a one-way ratchet. It doesn't allow for reconstruction after the end of economic warfare. It doesn't allow for normalization of banking and economic ties with the outside world. And I would argue that really diminishes the utility of sanctions as a tool of statecraft. Let me leave it at that, and I look forward to having a discussion with all of you.
Thank you very much. That was really a terrific overview. We'll turn it over. I have a question, comment myself, but we'll turn it over to Professor Djavad Salehi-Isfahani, after which we'll open it up to questions and answers. Please.
Thank you, Valence. Thank you, Ali, for a very nice summary of the origins of the project, and also for bringing me into this. When we talked first several years ago about doing this, I became aware that the resources at Johns Hopkins, the Rethinking Iran project, could be very helpful in changing the narrative in Washington. My first paper on sanctions goes back to 2009, when I was looking at Iranian youth, and I wrote a paper on Iranian youth in times of economic crisis, and I discussed how sanctions are going to hurt the next generation of Iranians with which the US would have to deal. And that actually is happening as we are talking. And I think that the book is taking that rethinking project one step further, because I hope it is now read next to other very interesting books on sanctions. In particular, the book by Richard Nephew, who is an architect of Iran sanctions, and whose book is more of a manual for the user manual for countries who want to sanction. And I think that's there are a lot of stuff in that book that are very useful, but some things that are missing. And I think our book, by focusing on the case of Iran it actually tests some of the hypotheses that Nephew puts out. The main point, I think, is to try to change the narrative from saying, okay, sanctions can work if you do it right. And Nephew has like 6 points about how to do it right. The first one says sanctions, you have to know your enemy, your adversary, so to speak. And there was very little of that. I think that's something that the book reveals. There's so much data that we use in this book to explain what has happened to Iran and Iranian households that some people at the World Bank have looked at that data, but the data, by the way, are publicly available. But I haven't seen anything coming out of the White House or these pro-sanction institutes like the Foundation for Defense of Democracies or United Against Nuclear Iran. They seem to not concern themselves with what is happening or have questions, but rather they know sanctions are working, you just need more of them. One of the assumptions in Nephew that touches on something that Ali said about inability to remove sanctions. You know, he says sanctions have to have clear goals. Yes, they should, but those goals have to be clear to the country that's sanctioned, not just to the sanctioners. If you say we are concerned about nuclear enrichment, and then the other side hears, and this is really true of Ayatollah Khamenei's position, is that no, you're not serious about that. You're going to go to human rights, then you're going to go to whatever. So if you're not credible in as an imperial power to say, no, we don't have geopolitical interests, we don't care, we don't mind if you're rising power and if you are threatening our allies, Saudi Arabia or Israel, we are really focused on this nuclear issue. Then the other side hears that this is going to be a long-term basis. And then comes this ability to remove sanctions. Suppose they believe you and they say that if you do limits, execute all this stuff in the JCPOA, that they will actually remove the sanctions. As everyone now knows, it's much easier to impose sanctions than to remove them. At some point, Secretary Kerry had to go around calling banks in Europe, saying, no, I'm really serious. We won't prosecute you if you work with Iran. But the banks didn't believe them because somebody else from the Treasury was calling them and reminding them of due diligence, that if they do anything that has to do with the IRGC, I don't know, provide a CT scan to an IRGC-owned hospital, they could be prosecuted. So it essentially froze all international trade routes for Iran. And this brings me to a very important point. You know, the sanctions don't just increase in quantity. People sometimes add them up and they say there are 9,000 sanctions or they've increased by 900%. Sanctions become qualitatively different when they become comprehensive. When you say, if you do this, we'll freeze your assets, that's a very clear point. And the sanctioned entity may say, okay, let's not do that. We don't want our funds frozen. Or if you say, okay, you have done it, now your funds are frozen, they again know that if they undo what they have done, sanctions would be removed, those funds would be unfrozen. But when you impose comprehensive sanctions and you go around for years telling all the banks, all the suppliers to Iran that if they do this or that, they could be fined, and you actually do bring multi-billion-dollar fines against a couple of banks, then you have chilled the global financial system to such an extent that it's going to be very hard for you to thaw that. And I think that's what happened in the case of Iran. Not only does some of the people in the Treasury were not genuinely interested in removing sanctions. In fact, in the whole Washington, D.C., there were people who said, yes, nuclear stuff is really important. We should stop Iran. But there were others who were saying very clearly that we need to contain Iran because it's a revolutionary regime. It's threatening our interests. And so sanctions to Iranian leaders, not all of them, to some of them, the more hardliners, sounded like this is going to be a permanent thing. So do something. That's why in 2014, Ayatollah Khamenei issued a directive about resistance economy. That was in response to the efforts that were leading to JCPOA. President Rouhani, Javad Zarif, they're very gung-ho in getting this. I think they were hoping that at least for a few years, there'll be more economic growth and Iran could go achieve more. And unfortunately, Trump came out of the blue and ended that too soon. JCPOA only lasted for 2 years, during which time Iran did spectacularly well. The GDP went up by 13% one year, 7% in the other, and then dropped suddenly the next 2 years. So in a way, sanctions did succeed. What we document is that GDP went down, GDP per capita, household expenditures, all reduced, poverty increased, doubled. Poverty now is twice, maybe 2.5 times what it was in 2011 before tight sanctions came. And so in a way, sanctions did work. They succeeded if they wanted to impoverish Iran. What they didn't succeed in doing was to get Iranians to behave differently. And as Ali mentioned, and everybody now can read in the press, there is this tension in the Middle East that's much worse than it was, and Iran is playing a much bigger role than it was with its allies in the region. And so we are nowhere closer to either containing Iran nor limiting its nuclear enrichment program. So did sanctions fail totally? I would say no. People who expect the sanctions to contain Iran, in a way, it has done that. Iran's economy is in doldrums. It is now probably going to be growing at 2-3% instead of 6-7-8%. And that's a way of containing Iran. What this will do in the long term, I don't think anybody knows. What we say in the book is that it cannot be good for Iran, nor can it be good for the United States, because the agents of political moderation in Iran, which are, in my view, the middle class, and it's not a controversial subject because you know that Rouhani's election and re-election was heavily supported by Iran's middle class. That middle class has been hurt. It's true that the poor have lost more because they can't afford to reduce their consumption. But when you shrink the size of the middle class, you are in a way jeopardizing the long-term development. The poor look up to the middle class in order to get out of poverty. When they see the middle class is running around trying to economize and cut their expenditures and they are in distress, then the poor lose hope for what they are going to do. So in a way, this weakening of the middle class, this thwarting of its rising role in the economy and in politics in Iran is not going to benefit the US if the US was seriously interested in political moderation in the region. Let me stop here and I'll be looking forward to answering more detailed questions.
Thank you, Djavad. That was another excellent presentation. As far as I know, the rationale for sanctions is really regime change. And the one case where it actually worked, and the one where a lot of people refer to it as a successful outcome, is South Africa. There you have the regime change, but everywhere else that sanctions have been imposed, whether we're talking about Iraq, Iran, Syria, Venezuela, Cuba is the longest one, and Russia today, it's really, as you were saying, Djavad, the middle class, but also the working class that really suffers, and not the regimes themselves. So I have, before I open it up, and I want to take the liberty, since I have to leave at 1, to pose a question, and I think it's a kind of an international relations question. So I think that Ali would be able to address it. Across the years, there have been UN sanctions as well. For example, the ones on Iraq. But most sanctions on an array of countries, including the ones that I just mentioned, and not just Iran, have been imposed unilaterally by the US. Does your book address why the US can take it upon itself to impose sanctions? What is it about the nature of the contemporary world order that can allow this? And is there any possibility that BRICS Plus might be a powerful challenger to that world order and to the sanctions regimes themselves?
Thank you. Those were both excellent questions. Let me start by just a very short point on South Africa, because I think there are a lot of misperceptions about what happened in South Africa, and especially in our own hyphenated Iranian communities abroad. This is often used as a example of success. The reality is that multilateral sanctions against South Africa succeeded because South Africa was primarily dependent economically on the West. And therefore, the West had significant leverage that could use to put pressure on South Africa. Iran today is not only no longer dependent on the West, but it has a lot of ways of circumventing sanctions in ways that even a decade ago or 2 decades ago were hard to imagine. Because of the overuse of the tool of sanctions, Iran has been able to create or at least join the club of sanctioned states, which help one another in order to skirt sanctions. And of course, the relationship with China is the most significant one here, because China remains Iran's sole oil customer. And if the US was to put tremendous pressure on China, the only way to achieve that would be to endanger US's own economy, given the intertwined nature of the two great economic powers, economic structures, China and the United States. The US would really have to start sanctioning Chinese state institutions in order to put pressure on China, which, given the tense relationship between the two countries right now, is quite unlikely. And of course, there were other differences in the case of South Africa as well. A viable alternative to the existing regime and a leadership like the one that Mandela presented that provided a positive picture for the future of the country. All of those elements are missing in Iran, and so I think the two comparisons are really not apt. In terms of why the U.S. can succeed in its unilateral sanctions, Val, it's a very interesting question, because I remember in 2017, 2018, there were a lot of policy discussions in Washington with opponents and proponents of reimposition of sanctions. And I think as someone who was in the opponent camp and believed that reimposition of sanctions was a mistake, I got some issues wrong, and people who were on the other side of the aisle, they also got some issues wrong. Key among them was on our side, was this perception that if the US was to unilaterally impose sanctions, it's not going to be as effective as was the case during the Obama administration, where it had the support of the Europeans and the Russians and the Chinese, that this would basically diminish US's leverage because sanctions are not going to be as effective. And of course, we were proven wrong, because even unilaterally, the US could not just outmatch the impact of sanctions during the Obama administration, but literally drive down Iran's oil exports to near zero in 2019. The hawkish camp in Washington was also wrong, because they believed that the fact that the Obama administration had taken a few major blocks out of this wall of sanctions and weakened the sanctions infrastructure, putting it back together would be nearly impossible, or would take an enormous amount of time. And both of those assumptions also turned out to be faulty. The US could do this almost overnight and very quickly. Now, the reason is that, if I want to put it in one sentence, the dollar is the king. And the global financial system is primarily still dependent on the US dollar. And the secondary sanctions that and financial sanctions that came into being in the 2010s are extremely powerful because they don't punish third-party companies and countries by imposing sanctions in the way that extraterritorial sanctions used to do. Secondary sanctions basically regulate the US market. So they basically tell European or Asian firms that it's your choice. You can either do business with Iran or business with the United States. And it's a very obvious choice for a lot of countries and companies, even the ones who had great interest in investing in Iran, that losing access to the US dollar and capital markets in the United States was something that the banks and major international firms did not want to risk. And that power, I think, is gonna remain pretty strong in the foreseeable future. But because of the overuse of sanctions, we now see movement towards creating alternative pathways. Yeah. It's not an immediate prospect, but I think over time, in the next maybe 5 to 10 years, as we see more decoupling between the Chinese economy and the US economy, more interest in countries trading in local currencies rather than tapping into the reference currency, all of those will eventually weaken the US dollar's role and the US's ability to use this tool. But that's not a immediate to short-term thing. It's right. More of a medium to long-term phenomenon.
Right, and it is, however, a deliberate strategy, yes, for the medium to long term. Djavad, did you want to?
Yes, that's a very excellent question you asked. You brought in BRICS. You know, that reminds me, our book is really about what has happened to Iran as a result of sanctions. There is another book to be written, which is how would Iran possibly get out of this? And there's not enough detail in our book about how Iran is evading sanctions. People are always interested. They're asking me about, you know, how do they sell oil? And I don't know much about that. But there's a book to be written about that. Iranians were not the only ones who were surprised by discovering that dollar is king. There were people in this country as well who didn't know how, in fact, monitoring the U-turns and things like that would jeopardize the trade of other countries. And it's now known that dollars become very important. And the question then, to answer your question about the BRICS, is can BRICS weaken the role of the dollar and bring another currency? Most people I read who know a lot more about international finance than I do are skeptical that this can happen. China is closed polity. In order to become a dominant financial power in the world, like England and UK and then the US, you need to have a certain openness. And when you have an authoritarian state like China, where you can jail your big industrialists or financiers like Jack Ma and others, you are not able to do what US does. People will not trust putting their money in China because the legal system is not going to help you. It's true that in the US that doesn't help either very much, as Iranians have found out, but China is worse. The other thing about BRICS that makes me skeptical is that, here's a fine economic point that I should take the opportunity to bring out, and it's in the book. We talk about how depreciation of Iranian currency has lowered real wages in dollar terms, so that Iranian products have become very cheap if you can export them. Iranian manufacturing products have had very hard time selling abroad, even though Iranian real wages are actually lower than Chinese real wages, again, in dollar terms. So in Tajikistan, you'd rather buy an Iranian product if you could, but you can't pay for it easily. So a lot of smaller producers, who are really the ones who should be rising at this point because they can export are not able to do that because the financial system is close to them. Big firms, especially the ones who sell oil, they can do better because they can bring tons of gold or suitcases of dollars on airplanes and so on. But the real advantage of the dollar is the ease of transactions that enables a small Sharif University student who has invented a little app to get paid and to buy stuff. That is closed. I don't know if BRICS can do that. The problem with BRICS is that the two big players are unable to engage in serious trade with Iran. We want a country, if other countries in BRICS could buy Iranian manufactured products, neither Russia nor China are interested. They just want oil or armaments in the case of Russia. If they could buy manufactured products, yes, we could do some kind of a efficient barter trade with those countries. Let's say Brazilians or South Africans discovered that Iranians make electrical switches that are very cheap and very reliable. They would buy a ton of it, and then Iran could buy something from them as well. So in that sense, in allowing Iran to escape the limitations of its domestic demand, which is depressed for well-known reasons, to escape that, go to the export market, to take advantage of its devaluations to increase production for exports.
Thank you for that. There's so much to be said about, declining U.S. hegemony and rising China, but that's another topic of discussion. Let me go to some of the questions that have been posed. There is a question from Alborz Mirzai. As U.S. is pretty sufficient in supplying its own energy comparing to Europe, can we argue that Europeans tend to benefit more than Americans from an agreement with Iran? Can they have a separate agreement with Iran? What do you say?
Djavad, do you want to take that?
I can briefly say, people really exaggerate this bilateral relationships in the energy market. For years, I've been writing, when I used to write on the oil market, that the oil market is fairly competitive, and oil is a very fungible product. If Iran doesn't sell you, you can buy it from somewhere else. The actual trade links are not that important anymore. There was a time when England needed oil from Iran for its ships because there were not many producers it could turn to if Iran didn't sell it to. But today, I don't think Iran is that important as a supplier of energy. We know energy supplies of Iran has gone down a lot, and the world is doing just fine. There was a argument in Tehran that we should wait for the cold European winter, and then Europeans will come and pressure America to revive JCPOA, and it did not happen. And at the time, I wrote that for a country that says we can withstand sanctions because we don't want to succumb to pressure and blackmail, it is very odd then to assume that the Europeans will do just that if Iran didn't sell them oil and they would go and pressure America. I would say the energy balance is very important for Russian sanctions. Europe is dependent directly through gas pipelines to Russia, so they can't turn to other producers. But Iranian products, if Iran doesn't sell to China, China can buy that same oil from somewhere else.
And
my understanding is that the Europeans are, that the United States actually has really ramped up its oil extraction and production. So, and some world system scholars are referring to this as the reperipheralization of the U.S. But Ali, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, in general, one of the lessons learned of the past 20 years of European-led diplomacy with Iran is that there's not much that Europe can do without the United States. I mean, we had the 2003 to 2005 experience that the E3 negotiated with Iran. Iran suspended its nuclear program. but the Europeans could not reciprocate Iranian concessions because the US was not on board. And then post-2018 US withdrawal from the JCPOA as well, we had a similar experience. The Europeans had the political will and wanted to preserve the JCPOA, but could not deliver economic incentives because they couldn't do it with the United States. And they also woke up to the reality that Europe basically does not have economic sovereignty. But there is this argument that whether if the US had more skin in the game, because you remember in the nuclear deal, there were only a few exemptions to US primary sanctions that allowed imports of Iranian pistachios and carpets and saffron and caviar. But it also allowed US subsidiaries to invest in the Iranian economy, and also the Boeing deal, which was one key marquee deal. But that's it. And so the argument has been since then whether if the US had more skin in the game, that would create more staying power for a deal with Iran. And that's a question that I think has to be explored in the future.
Interesting. Let me now pose a second question from the audience. This is Daniel Rod. With the potential for a second Trump, oh, what happened to his? Oh, sorry. There was another. Okay, this sort of jumped down. It had to do with the potential for a second Trump administration, and of course, probably more sanctions without clear goals. What can we expect? And what else could they, I don't know whether they refers to the US or to Iran, do in the case of a second Trump administration? Not that the Biden administration has been much different, but there you go.
I can
like to take that
question.
Yeah.
So look, I think we have to make a distinction between Trump and the Trump administration. I think just like in the first term, Trump is probably intrigued by the prospect of doing something similar to what he did with North Korea, the photo op opportunity, boasting about the fact that he has been he's achieved a better deal than the Obama administration, or outsmarted the cunning Iranians at the negotiating table. All of that is attractive to him. But he is very likely to bring to power a team who would be running the policy for him, who are as, if not more hostile than the people who were in charge in his first term. And in fact, I think they would hit the ground running in ways that we didn't see in the first term. There was much more hesitance about what's the right approach for the first year and a half. Remember that they stayed in the JCPOA, and only when Bolton and Pompeo joined, they pursued a very hostile policy. But people who are drafting his second term foreign policy agenda now are true and true ideologues who believe that the only reason that maximum pressure did not succeed was that not because it was a faulty strategy, but because it wasn't fully implemented. And so if you pursue an ultimate pressure policy, it will magically work and would result in Iran surrendering. And so I am very cynical about the prospects of a second Trump term. And I fear that the combination of heightened threat perception on the Iranian side by an administration that will be way more hostile, and depending on what's happening in the war in Gaza, also more threats within the region, and the fact that there will be no exit ramp to use the nuclear leverage that Iran has at the negotiating table, that all of these elements would push Iran towards the ultimate deterrent, which is basically developing nuclear weapons.
Very good. Thank you for that. There's a question here by Ali Saidi, and I think that Djavad, this might be one that you can take on. What economic policies can Iran implement in the current situation to reduce the effects of sanctions on the middle class or the working and poor classes?
Yeah, that's a very good question. would say I'm not in a position to give advice to the Iranian government about what to do. I don't know the constraints there, the policy, constraint policies, but there's a policy that I've advocated, and that is removing the subsidy for energy and turning it into cash transfers. There's a debate in Iran whether that would work or not, and there's a mixed record of the last time this was done in 1990. So, sorry, in 2010, it's 1390 Iranian year, so I mixed up. President Ahmadinejad instituted this program and made a mistake. He promised much more money as cash transfer that he was making from higher energy prices. So the program became very inflationary and was discredited. But that program can be run better. And what it can do is to help the government disperse the benefits of the national wealth that the population has given it more equitably. Right now, the top decile of income classes in Iran consume 10 times as much energy and subsidies than the poor. If you were to charge international prices to everyone, there will be a big redistribution from the upper half of the income distribution to the lower half. And several of those deciles would be middle class, but the poor would definitely benefit. And this is not a welfare program, by the way. This is simple justice. Iranians own oil, no matter what their level of income. So anyone who uses their wealth ought to compensate it for them. Now, it's true that it might be better if the government took the money and built roads and schools and all that, but that record isn't that good and that just. You know, anybody who's traveled across Iran sees all the multiple highways in Tehran and then the rural roads, knows that the oil money is not being equitably distributed across the regions. You know, Sistan and Baluchistan is not nearly getting as the Tehran province or Markazi. There are other policies that they can do to promote small and medium enterprises where the middle class work. And the way you do that is when you think about your export strategy, you don't just think about, okay, we can give 1 million barrels of oil to IRGC to put it on ships and go trade it on the middle of the oceans. You think about when you go to China, whether you can get them to buy something from these small producers in Iran. When you travel, and they do travel, President Raisi has been to Africa and so on, you can bring up the trade with a specific purpose of circumventing the fact that Iran cannot use dollars for exchange by finding ways to ease transactions between a small producer, let's say in my hometown of Nishabur, and some buyer in Kenya. That can be done. It takes a lot of diplomatic effort, and it takes a big shift from big item exports to small item exports, specifically from oil to manufacturers.
That's interesting. I think that addresses one or two of the other questions too. One has to do with, there is a certain trend within Iran that claims that Iran is actually succeeding with sanctions, but you seem not to agree with that. And then another question about the possibility of establishing dollar-free economic ties.
You want
Do you think you have
answer that question about succeeding? Yes, I know Iran has succeeded in some sense. It has weathered the worst of the Trump-Biden sanctions. its economy actually has been growing in the last few years. The latest data that I wrote about, the last 9 months, GDP was 6.7% higher. But you have to remember that this is not going to continue. Sanctions is a very dynamic game. When US Treasury finds what Iran is doing to get 6% growth rate, they will find a way to limit that growth. And we have to accept that US has a chokehold on the global markets. It's very hard for Iran to fully escape that. What Iran should notice is that the main way to escape sanctions is not to find buyers for oil. It is to allow this amazing opportunity that Iranians have created for themselves by taking their consumption down, by suffering, which is very low real wage. And this needs to find a buyer. And the way to find a buyer is to do trade, not in oil, but in goods they produce. That can create employment. I think it's much better for people to receive money from work than from cash transfers. All that is dependent on authorities in Iran realizing that selling more oil isn't really escaping sanctions. It is selling manufacturers, creating jobs that is escaping sanctions. And that we haven't seen yet all that much.
Right. And that would entail some kind of support and promotion by government too. You know, income inequality has really increased in Iran. What about a wealth tax that could then be redistributed, if not in the form of cash transfers, but at least support for manufacturing?
Well, I may jump in. There's that's a tall order, wealth tax. We don't know what people's expenditures and incomes are.
It's a tall order even in the US,
Yes, exactly. So if Iran cannot do a simple tax, which is if you fill your car with gasoline, pay me for it. If you cannot do that, then to say, well, you have a villa in Spain and I want you to pay me tax, or you have a villa in Caspian Sea. No, that is not going to work. I think taxation in Iran is far behind even middle-income countries. Why? Because we have had oil income. We weren't very serious. Until recently, we didn't realize that government budgets need taxation.
Yeah.
And now we have realized that we have to erect that structure for taxation. It requires a lot of stuff, including reducing corruption, because people don't pay taxes. They have huge incentives to escape taxes when they perceive that there's a lot of corruption across the country. And because corruption depends on removal of sanctions to some extent, to increase transparency, Iran must not be trying very hard to hide every transaction from America. If you're doing that, you're probably hiding it from yourself too. So you have here a tangled web that makes me think that Iran should really think very hard about reaching a deal to be able to do its transactions, a deal that is not what pompous Pompeo wanted a few years ago with 12-point thing, but one that is equitable and recognizes Iran's sacrifices and its stature in the Middle East.
That in and of itself is a tall order. I don't know if the U.S. is ready for that without some push, a big push from some of the challengers within and outside the BRICS. I don't see any other questions, or perhaps I'm not able to. Let's see. All right, somebody has just let us know, Ali Saidi has just let us know that if fewer people participate in the meeting today, it's probably because this meeting coincided with the derby, I guess the football, Persepolis and Istiqlal. And it's also Çarşamba Suri. So, we have to recognize that perhaps we could have found a different day. Folks, I'm afraid that I have to leave, but this has really been such an interesting discussion. Congratulations to you and your co-authors and the co-contributors on what promises to be a very, very good book. I haven't read it yet, but I will. But I have read the Iran sanctions papers, of course. And thank you to Kamiar Mohassis and Mohammad Farzodegan for organizing this and for allowing me to chair it. It's been really enlightening to me as well. And I will now say goodbye and turn it over to Mohammad. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you,
Hamigi.
So if you let me in the remaining time, there are more questions and comments. Please feel free to put it in Q&A. There is one question from Dr. Reza Omidi, who is asking or is writing that it seems that economic sanctions have basically strengthened the discourse in Iran that emphasizes the rollback and rollback the government from social and welfare services, to making the government basically smaller. This puts more pressure on the lower layers of the middle classes. What do you think, Djavad or Ali, about this possibility in Iran under the sanctions?
Ali, do you want to go first? Or?
I think you're much better placed, Javad.
Thank you. Well, there is no doubt that the government's ability to deliver services and including income protection is reduced because of sanctions. We all know that the majority of government's revenue came from oil exports. It's lost that. It hasn't been able to replenish that with taxes. As a result, is running a budget deficit that has become endemic. It causes inflation. That's why Iran's inflation this year is going to top 40%. And all this is hurting the salaried class, a lot of whom are in the middle income groups. So yes, there's going to be a lot of difficulty reaching those people. I agree. But the bigger problem is maybe hidden in terms of services that declined in quality, not in quantity. And people are suffering, but we don't have a very good measure of that hurt. If you look at the education system, it has a lowly budget to begin with, but you can imagine that as the government cuts on its development projects and other projects, it's going to go to the education budget. If there was a plan to improve schools in disadvantaged areas to bring them up to even half the quality of schools in Tehran, they probably postponed that. The education ministry would have a hard time getting government funding for these very important projects. So in a way, just like government's decision to postpone repairing the highways and bridges, there are some expenditures that border development and welfare, like improving school quality, that will be sacrificed. Unless the government is able to get more oil revenues, or it is able to raise revenues from domestic sources via taxes or reduce energy subsidies, I don't see any easy way to reduce the pain on lower income groups. One last point. The government is better in a way, Iranian government is better in reaching the very poor, the bottom 1 or 2 deciles, than reaching the median income households. As a result, although it's more important to make sure the poor doesn't suffer more, starve, but the fact that the middle class is declining, that should be an area of concern. I likened the middle class in an Iranian interview with Tejad Farda to the canaries in the mine, where if you want to know what's going to happen in the future, you see how the middle class is doing. And as I said before, if the middle class is not doing well, the poor lose their hope for a brighter future for themselves or for their children. And I think that's what has happened in Iran already. Everybody talks about less hope. And when hope is reduced, individuals don't invest, private sector reduces investment. And I think this is something to bring up because it's not as visible as the rate of inflation or the unemployment rate or poverty rate. This is something which is forward-looking. Decisions made today, their impact will be revealed in 5 to 10 years, and I think it's very important to emphasize those now. School quality has to be kept up, and the youth have to have hope that living in the country, growing up there, getting jobs, getting married there is something that's possible, not only possible, but also something to look forward to.
Thank you, Djavad. But the point that you mentioned just before regarding the effects of sanctions on the size of middle class, weakening this part of the economy, putting them or pushing them to the poverty or the lower level of income, and also negatively affecting the hope of the poor for future improvement in their socioeconomic conditions, might also result to basically reduction of cost of engaging in the conflict, protest, and violence, right? So in that sense, this expansion of poverty under the sanctions, increasing inflation, increasing unemployment, especially given the demographic structure of Iran, which is quite young still. So that might basically make the political situation in Iran more unstable, and in the worst cases might result to a kind of chaos or things which might ultimately cover one of the goals of centers of the sanction, namely changing the political institution, not through the peaceful way, but through more violent. So given the fact that your book was about also effectiveness of the sanctions, so depending on what is the goals of the sanctions, and one of the goals under at least Trump administration was the change in the political system in Iran, don't you see that the sanctions have been successful in that direction to at least makes the domestic politics in Iran much more unstable through these economic pressures? Would you not interpret this as a partial success of the sanctions?
It is a partial success of the sanctions, but if you think in terms of this chain of effects, you have sanctions, reduced GDP per capita, reduced household resources, poverty rising, and then going from rising poverty to protests and pressure on the regime. We know a lot more about the first part, how sanctions increase poverty and create unhappiness. We know very little, and I'm not a sociologist, political scientist, but it doesn't take one to know that that's a very, very difficult area of research to be able to predict that once poverty increases or the middle class becomes impoverished, their first reactions go to the streets and protest. First of all, this kind of thinking is very callous, to say that we will make people very unhappy so they can actually risk their lives and go into the streets. And secondly, we just don't know. Maybe they do something else. Maybe they become more concerned about helping their kid leave the country. Maybe the poor become so preoccupied with attending to the daily needs of their families that if somebody says, there's a protest, let's go there, they would say, no, yeah, that has to wait. I'm sorry, I'm doing other things.
Okay, thank you.
And
would you
if
like
I
to
may
add?
if you look at the recent protests in Iran, whether the primarily economic ones like 2017, 2018, or the one in 2019, and then obviously the more political, social one in 2022, In all of these cases, there does not seem to be any shortage of bullets and batons or anti-riot gear within the Iranian security forces. So sanctions have not necessarily weakened the regime's repressive arm. It has weakened the middle class. That, I think, as Djavad said, there is evidence for it, but there's also no evidence that in any ways that it has weakened the regime's ability to control the crowds and to repress the protests. And in that sense, if you look at similar situations like in Syria or in Venezuela or in Cuba, I think it really amounts to magical thinking to believe that economic discontent definitely translates into a transition to democracy, especially when the democratic infrastructure in the country, which I think is primarily represented by the civil society, is absolutely in ruins. Both as a result of repressive policies by the Islamic Republic, but also as a result of impoverishment generally caused by sanctions and mismanagement and corruption.
And if I may add something, Mohammed, to this issue, we talked earlier about the analogy between South Africa, sanctions on South Africa and sanctions on Iran. And I'm reminded that I actually had an interview that was on Belfer's website. I think it is still there, where they asked me whether sanctions on Iran are likely to succeed. This is, again, 10, 15 years ago. And I said sanctions in South Africa succeeded in part because the population that was suffering had the same goals as the sanctioners, the US and the Western countries. And that is not clear in Iran. And I think that is changing. I think the proportion of people who believe what the US is doing is for the good of the Iranian people, I don't think that is the case, especially in the current very violent, almost sickening Israeli bombardment of Gaza, where Iran has taken the side of the Palestinians. I think more Iranians are likely to turn against Western powers who have failed to call for a ceasefire and become a little bit more tolerant of the government's foreign policy. Before that, we had a lot of demonstrations in which people said, abandon Gaza, abandon Lebanon, pay attention to us. But I think the geopolitics has changed a little bit. And I think it's possible that Iranians are more sympathetic, not entirely sympathetic, but some Iranians on the margin are more sympathetic to Iranian government saying we are at war with the West and you have to tolerate. So that would mean what it tells me is that the likelihood of more protests based on the economics, not based on social policies of the government, but based on economics is going to be have less momentum than it did in the past. And this is something to keep in mind as regional geopolitics change. It's debatable whether it's changing in favor of Iran or not, but the Western powers are certainly becoming discredited with their propaganda about human rights, that's all they care about, and so on. So if you think like that, you would think that this last connection of increased poverty and protests and behavior change on the part of Iranian government is becoming weaker by the day.
Well, I agree with Ali and also with you regarding this issue that the sanctions are not helpful to make a country more democratic and even make autocratic system more stronger, right? What we observed, especially since Trump sanctioned 2018 up to now, there are more frequency of protests within Iran for different reasons, socio-economic reasons. And not only frequency, but intensity of that also is increasing. This is one observation that we have. Basically, we know that protests, especially the violent protests, violence from both sides, will increase also the risk of investment and doing business. All these things that you also mentioned regarding small business formation, entrepreneurship activities, part of that negatively affected by risk of political risk and instability risk. And if that negatively affect the condition of economic growth within Iran and increasing economic pains and difficulties within Iran, one can say, in that sense, part of the goals of the sanction is increase the economic cost on a system which is deviating from international norms, depending on the definition of those norms, would have achieved within Iran. And this is something which the cost will be imposed on the civil society, of course. And this is what we can observe it. But whether at the end it is a right solutions to basically encourage democratization with Iran, or empowering the middle class Iran, probably this is not the outcome. So
sorry, so I don't want to interrupt you, but I just wanted to say a little something inspired by the analysis you were doing. I don't like the message of our book to be that sanctions are bad, do something else. And that something else then would be war. I think Ali was correct earlier. He said the tensions are increasing, the risk of military conflict is increasing, and that's very bad. I like to think that we are saying, yes, sanctions are not as good as you think. They have a big cost. But there is a third alternative, and that's diplomacy. That's what's tried and might have had a chance if Trump had not withdrawn. My own belief is that that was a real one of those things that Acemoglu and Robinson talk about critical events that change the course of history. If Trump had not withdrawn, 2 consecutive elections in which Iranians participated, the middle class participated, and they went in the direction of moderation, might have continued, might have convinced the Iranian conservatives that living with this more moderate middle class is possible and it's not so bad. Their kids would have good schools, universities would be working a lot better than they are now. And that vision was kind of destroyed. I think still it's good time to think about these 3 alternatives. You can have war, you can have sanctions, or you can have diplomacy, understanding, and try to reach a compromise. This is how people approach their personal lives within the family, within the community. They don't deal with conflicts that arise. First, let's go beat them up. Then let's avoid them, sanction them, and then never talk to them. I hope that that message is maybe not so clear in the book is there. We are not saying sanctions are bad, therefore you might as well just do war, but do more diplomacy.
Diplomacy and more integration of Iran within the global markets. That would probably be a solution, which you also mentioning, more globalization of Iran.
Global markets have been historically a source of moderation. They don't prevent war completely, but they have created the kind of life we have had for the last 50 years, which has been pleasant. People have been growing, countries have been growing, and life has been improving.
That's true. That's true. Thank you very much.
Mohammed, sorry to drag on this part of the conversation, but I feel it's important to say that I think while I absolutely agree with what you and Djavad were saying in terms of right policy choices, one has to remember that there is a lot of opposition to the idea of a mutually beneficial deal with the Islamic Republic within different circles, be it Iranian exile community, be it some of Iran's neighbors, be it hardliners in the United States. And it's primarily because, I've been arguing for a long time that in these circles, Iranian enrichment seems to be a bigger problem than uranium enrichment. And that, I think, creates a situation in which sanctions are not a means to an end, but they become an end in and of themselves. And that creates the stickiness that I was talking about in terms of difficulty of removing them. But there is now a 45-year track record of different U.S. approaches towards Iran, and I think it's not really it takes very little imagination and study to understand what has worked and what hasn't worked. Containment, coercion, sanctions have not really reduced the threat that the U.S. sees emanating from Iran. The only thing that has resulted in Iran rolling back an activity that the U.S. did not like has been diplomacy. And so we know what works and what doesn't work, and we can go through this experience over and over again and try to relearn the lesson, or we can try to apply it in other cases. But it is important to understand that this is easier said than done. Even in a scenario that we have a Biden 2.0 in 2025, there are pressures on the timeline because, of course, Iran has its own presidential election next year. But also that the Security Council resolution 2231 that endorsed the JCPOA is set to expire in October of next year. So there is already an end point in which, if we don't have a sustainable solution to the nuclear issue, or at least maybe even a partial solution, it's possible that the West would resort to snapping back the UN sanctions, which France and the UK can do as still members of the JCPOA. And of course, that would create a major crisis because we know what Iran would do, which is to withdraw from the NPT. And the last country that did that was North Korea, and we all know how that story ended. And in 2025, Iran is going to have significantly more nuclear leverage than was the case in 2015, compared with the United States, which has almost exhausted its sanctions leverage. I use the analogy that if dial of sanctions right now is 8 out of 10. So even with much stricter enforcement, or a Trump administration imposing more sanctions in the future, you can at best get to 9 out of 10. You would never get to 10 out of 10 because of some structural issues that I described, especially Iran's relations with its neighbors and with Russia and China that provided with exit ramps. But it's magical thinking to believe that an extra dial on sanctions going from 8 to 9 would be a game changer in terms of U.S. being able to get to its objectives. But there is also, as I said, an asymmetry in the leverage accumulated by both sides next year if we can get back to the negotiating table, and that already creates mismatch expectations of what is possible and what's not possible. I would argue we would never get a deal that was as good as the JCPOA from a non-proliferation perspective. And 90% of the political elite in this town believe that the JCPOA was a bad deal. So how are you going to get a deal that is better than the JCPOA, more sellable and more sustainable, is a major question that right now I don't see anyone really thinking about it in a strategic way within this administration or even in the think tank or academic community.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ali, for these final comments and explanation. Also, Djavad, for very good covering of the economic part of this book. Of course, the book is very detailed and very rich in its arguments, and I suggest our audience to have a look on this book. And I appreciate also Kamgyor and Valentine contribution for this panel, for the audience, for being here despite all these other activities in Iran, the football and the Chorsham Suri and so on and so forth. And I would like to remind that the IIEA conference, annual conference this year will happen in Qatar, Doha, with the host of Dr. Hassan Hakimian. And I have posted the link for call for paper in the chat. So please, if you are doing the research on Iranian economy, feel free to submit your papers to this conference. And don't forget also for membership in IIEA from Iran, outside of Iran, that would be very much important for us for activities in IIEA, for future activities. I wish you all the best for coming New Year, next week, New Year, Nowruz. And again, thanks to the panelists for joining us for this book presentation. And our next webinar would be in April. We will announce it, and we will be in touch with all of you through our website, social media, and the other channels. Thank you very much, and we'll say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.